I've been looking forward to this for months. The only thing was is I didn't realize that my first leg of my flight out here yesterday was going to be the flight from hell. And what you have to realize, being from North Carolina and being an NC State graduate, you're right in the middle of a basketball legacy era or area known as the Tobacco Road. And that's just within a 30-mile radius. You've got NC State in Raleigh. You've got Wake Forest, the home of Wake Forest University. You have Duke University in Durham, and then you have Hill over in Chapel Hill. That's Carolina. So yesterday, apparently Sunday morning, there was this rush on the internet to buy up all these available tickets to the last game of the Final Four. I don't know where they came from, but they must have showed up because the flight to Salt Lake City, I was on a Boeing 737, and generally that's a pretty good sized plane, but if you've got an aisle seat, you're in good condition. The thing was, I was the only person on that flight that was not wearing Carolina blue. It was tough. But thank goodness the flight from Salt Lake City to here gave me a little bit of a reprieve. I'd like to talk to you a little bit here today about the role of inspectors and inspections and our Scour program. Well, why is Scour important? The early commerce and development of our country relied on waterways for the major transportation network, and we were blessed with it. In modern day, our commerce is really dependent on our transportation highway network. And of course, the conflict or the confluence of both of those creates a lot of opportunities with bridges over waterways. And of course, what we're interested in here today is the Scour component of that. Well, why is Scour important? It's because the public and Congress expects and demands that the bridges over our waterways be safe. You think about it, the commerce of our country depends on it to some degree. Maybe the defense of our country depends upon it. But you look around and every one of us are affected daily by our loved ones and our friends traveling our roadways, and when they approach a bridge, they're expecting that bridge to let them be able to cross safely. A lot of times our family members don't even understand that they're crossing a bridge. Not to say they're distracted drivers, but they just don't even understand that it's a bridge. So let's look back on history and see where it kind of got us to where we are in the Scour program today. And of course, it initiated with the Scour Creek failure in New York in 1987. And that really got Congress's attention, and they said, okay, we need to start doing something about it. In federal highways, you're going to implement a program to do it. Hatchie River occurs in '89. Same thing. It was a Scour-related issue, and Congress says, look, this is not just a wake-up call. This is something we've got to do. I-5 in California occurs in 1995, another Scour-related issue. I-35W in Minneapolis in recent times, although that was not a Scour-related failure, the Inspector General's report to Congress ended up making Congress so cognizant of public safety and bridges, they asked Federal Highway, are there any other issues with bridges today and public safety? And of course, Federal Highways went back to them and said, yes, Scour. So let's take a look at some of the case studies. Scour Creek, the bridge failure there, that was found to be that there had been some Scour issues around a foundation in the interior bent, and riprap had been applied. Whether it was sized properly or not was questionable, but the real thing that came out of the findings was that the New York Turnpike Authority had failed to monitor and inspect the condition of the riprap to see if it needed adjustments. Hatchie River Bridge in Tennessee, that failure was a stream stability failure. And that was one, again, that had been monitored, and the inspectors had actually documented some of the stream stability issues beneath the bridge. but Tennessee DOT failed to properly recognize what was going on, or the communication through the chain of commands didn't pass along, as you see here, the various channel configurations over time. It's today we would take this as an obvious sign that some action needs to be taken. The I-5 California failure. This was one, there was a land subsidence issue downstream, which actually started a head cut moving back upstream through the bridge. That, coupled along with changes in watershed use, generated about a 30% increase in discharge through the opening. And on top of that, maintenance had gone out there and installed a solid web between the post and beam piers, and it worsened a angle of attack condition, which that just accelerated the scour. So, what was learned? Basically, it pointed out the fact that there was a lot of difficulty for inspection of the bridges, but primarily it indicated there was a break in the communication link also between the inspections, maintenance, and the design functions. So the design folks say, well, we designed it right, construction built it right. Well, the inspectors need those as-built plans out there to see what changes are going on and be able to document what changes over time are, to get a good grasp on mitigation efforts that could be taken to prevent some catastrophe. And of course, from the inspection standpoint, design needs to be informed of what's going on out there so that they can look and see if there's something that can be done from a reasonable mitigating standpoint. So what are the fundamental keys of a successful scour program? Well, the regulation and authority comes out of Congress. Now, I know contrary to what a lot of you may think, Federal Highway does not make the regulations and laws. Congress enacts the laws. Federal Highway Administration is basically responsible for stewardship and oversight. And the guidelines are actually developed through AASHTO in collaboration with Federal Highway Administration and AASHTO. But before it's vetted by AASHTO, it goes out to all the states, and the bridge owners have an opportunity to comment on that. So the main role of Federal Highway Administration is stewardship and oversight, and we help promote research out there to advance the state of practice. But the real key to the successful program is folks like you who are the boots on the ground out there every day to see what's going on. So you are the forward observer on that battlefield with scour. Let's look at what types of scour there are. You've got general scour, and most everybody's familiar with degradation issues and head cuts, but what about aggradation? In situations like that where you have a buildup of material, and a lot of times you find it in mountainous areas where you have a tributary or a major stream coming down off a steep slope, but as it approaches the valley's edge where the roadway is, that gradient in the stream flattens out, so all that heavy material that's coming down through that steep slope is deposited right there at your bridge site. What happens when you get aggradation like that? It builds up the bed. It denies the waterway area under the bridge. What it can do is force the conveyance of the water over the roadway approaches at the bridge, and then you've got problems that are not necessarily bridge, but it's still interfering with and disrupting the flow of traffic out there. Contraction scour, that's just the general movement of material out from beneath a bridge because of the restricted flow area. You've got live bed and clear water. Live bed flow is that in the channel areas where if you look down there, and I know all of you seen it, that little moving sand dune appearance down there, that's live bed. The clear water scour is usually what happens in your overbank areas underneath the bridge where you get that contracted scour or contracted flow from upstream going through the bridge in the floodplain area beneath the bridge, on the larger bridges. So here's a couple examples of the general scour. As you can see on the left, you have the general degradation in long-term scour. The one on the right is a head cut. And you can see there's actually been some mitigation effort attempted in there to save the bridge, but even that has been jeopardized. Contraction scour, as we were talking about a while ago, you get that flow coming in from the wide floodplain. Basic simple hydraulics is discharge is equal to velocity times area. If you take that floodplain area and you restrict it to the area beneath the bridge, you're reducing that area, so velocity has to go up. So that's what creates your scour beneath the bridge. Local scour. You've got abutment scour, pier scour, and some of you may have had the opportunity to deal with spur dike or embankment scour. And the purpose of a spur dike is basically to help make the bridge opening more efficient by actually funneling water upstream into the bridge opening and then out of the opening in a uniform manner to prevent that formation of those eddies or vortexes that create the scour. And what can be done is you're actually not eliminating the scour totally. What you're doing is moving that scour out from beyond the bridge to where it's not going to be noticed at the bridge immediately and cause a problem at the bridge. Scour that occurs several feet or 100 feet upstream or downstream gives you time to monitor that scour at the spur dike and do remedial action if it's needed. And of course, pressure scour and tidal. And the abutment scour, the one on the left is just your typical example of an abutment scour with a pile foundation. The one on the right's one that occurred about 6 weeks ago in Wisconsin. And actually there was a abutment scour problem on the indent to the right just off of the picture about 2 years ago. Maintenance went in and put a POR in there, a pile of rock, and it protected that particular abutment, but it forced the flow back over to the other abutment, which caused the failure. And I'm not picking on maintenance because I do, having worked with our maintenance folks in North Carolina for decades, the maintenance folks do a great job with what limited resources and often time that they have to do something in. And a lot of times the only thing they can do is put a Band-Aid on it, but that's what they have available to them, and they try to do the best they can. So I'm not knocking the maintenance efforts. Local scour, there again is another example of discharge equals velocity time area. Even though that pier in the middle of the stream, it represents a small cross-sectional area in the flow path, it still creates that same situation that water's speeding up to get around it because you've got the same amount of water coming in that's going out. And so water has to speed up to get around that pier. Pressure flow, basically that is when water gets up on the superstructure, you're looking at a situation just like horizontal contraction scour, except this is a contraction scour in the vertical direction. Combining the effects of scour. You have the original bed profile up here at the top, and then you have long-term degradation, which takes it down to this darker strip through here. And then that darker strip represents the contraction scour factor. And then on top of that, you add in your local scour, which is your scour at the bridge pier. And also, there's the potential for that same type of scour at each of the abutments. So yes, you do combine all the effects of those that we've been talking about. This right here is a good example of combination of scour. In the forefront, it's apparent that this has to be pressure flow that has actually scoured out the area just in front of the parapet as the flow passed beneath the bridge, and it started that diving action from that vertical contraction. But if you'll look in the background back there, you can actually see what appears to be local scour around the piers at some of those last three piers. And I'll guarantee you this pier up here in the very front where the pressure flow is dominant, if you really took soundings out there, you'd probably find it is deeper than probably the local scour back in the background back there, because it's been added to the pressure flow scour. So Congress asked Federal Highway to implement a risk-based and data-driven bridge program. And in 2011, Federal Highways applied that to the Scour program as well. And what the risk-based data-driven approach does is it allows bridge owners to focus their level of effort and their limited resources oftentimes to those bridges that have the greatest importance. And to do that, you must establish what those criteria of high risk and low risk are. So let's take a look at it. What is the risk based on, and what is the data-driven part based on? The risk-based part is basically what is the importance of the highway. Significant interstate and major traffic conveyance arteries. Some may be important for connectivity of the community, some may be important for commerce locally. But those might be your high-risk bridges. Your medium-risk bridges are those that may be state-owned bridges on the state system and maybe have long detour routes that have to be accommodated. But then you get into another category is those low-risk bridges, those out in the rural areas, those county road systems, very low ADT bridges. What's the data-driven component? And of course, all of you are familiar with the top several of those items, and they're very logical, but a lot of people overlook the bottom two. One is the asset value. What is the repair replacement cost? And of course, oftentimes you look at length of the bridge or the deck area as a surrogate for the value of that bridge if it had to be replaced. Another one is the remaining life cycle. You know, how much is the remaining life of that bridge? And that might help you decide whether you need to go to a structural or a hydraulic countermeasure or maybe a long-term monitoring for the remaining life of the bridge. Now, one of the things you want to look at is to make sure in that life cycle analysis is there a replacement for that bridge that is funded? Now, if it's just one that, yeah, the life cycle's another 10 years or another 15 years, that's one thing, because as we all know, as we manage our programs, those replacement dates are not cast in stone, and they are prioritized on need within the system. So particularly those bridges that have funded replacements, those are ones that maybe long-term monitoring might be the countermeasure. But they all need a plan of action, because it is mandated that all scour critical and unknown foundation bridges have an active plan of action. So how do you apply that? This is just a typical decision-making matrix that I put on here. And basically, if you look at it in the lower left-hand corner, if you've got a bridge that has low importance that you've already established, and it's a low consequence of failure, in other words, if there's an acceptable detour route, if it's not going to make too much of a burden on the community, those are the ones that have the less detailed plan of action. But then there again, if you have a high risk and a high consequence of failure bridge, those need a very detailed plan of action. And the reason we say this risk-based and data-driven portion in the plan of action category is, why should the bridge owners, program managers spend all their time developing a 16 or 18-page document for this rural road out here that carries 100 vehicles a day, and that's about it. And there's an accessible detour around it. Those are the ones that, why waste time developing a 16-page plan of action for that when you need to be focusing on those more important highways? where you're going to need to communicate information about who's going to close it, who's authorized to close it, how's the communication going to get out to the community, what are the detour routes, how are those detour routes going to be marked, and on and on. So, why have a plan of action? Well, all bridges with known deficiencies require a plan of action. Are all plans of actions equal? Yes. Public safety is paramount. So all plan of actions, whether they're a 2-page or a 16-page plan of action, all of them are important. And all of them need to be reviewed and updated, and if anything is ever looked at or monitored out at a site, it needs to go back into the bridge file as some type of documentation that, yes, this plan of action is being utilized, particularly when some of the division bridge engineers go out and start looking at the bridge files and say, well, this has got a plan of action on it, are y'all following it? Well, what happens if 6 years from now the person in charge of that bridge file is gone and somebody new comes in and they goes, well, I don't know. The only thing I have in the file is just this plan of action. I don't know if anybody's ever enacted it or not. So some documentation of its use really needs to be there as well. Are all plans of action the same? Risk-based plans of actions can provide the owner, as I mentioned, a means of managing the level of effort and resources that they have in their bridge system. So, the plan of action, as we discussed a while ago, should be including the type and frequency of inspection, detour routes, if appropriate for the high risk, what would be looked at if it's in a monitoring mode. And then the high risk ones are the plan of actions that would be looking at a replacement or a countermeasure installation, and the countermeasure installation needs to be done in a timely manner, but this plan of action is enacted until such time as it is either replaced or that countermeasure goes back into place, and at that point, then the plan of action can be removed from that bridge. So, what types of countermeasures we were talking about? Structural and hydraulic versus monitoring. Here again, same decision-making process. And this isn't anything new to the engineer, particularly in the maintenance arena. We deal with it every day, but a lot of times people take it for granted and don't really apply it consistently and across the entire system. And that's what Federal Highways is really interested in, is that these efforts, this risk-based approach, can be applied consistently and uniformly across the entire system. Some of the other items that affect stream bridge stability or assure bridge stability is stream stability. This is a perfect example right here in 1937 on the bottom and 1966. If you'll look, the meanders are starting to bulge and sway to the downstream side. Now, one thing about it, meanders always move downstream. So if you have a meander at the bridge or just below the bridge, that's going to eventually move on out. But if you've got a meander just upstream of a bridge, that needs to be monitored or be noted and documented, because over time that meander upstream of the bridge is going to work its way beneath the bridge. Because a stream, a natural waterway, has an equilibrium system to it, and it tries to stay in equilibrium, and anything that alters it is going to end up exacerbating any of the changes in the stream. And if you'll notice in the bottom picture, there's not an awful lot of sandbars in the bend, but if the top one up there, you see the sandbars on the inside of the bends, And what that's doing is those sandbars is that trying to balance that equilibrium, but it's pushing the streams to the outside and downstream direction. And of course, that's a prime example of a bank instability issue. Now, this one wasn't necessarily created by a meander in the stream. This one was actually the farmer, and I'm not knocking the farmer, I was raised on a dairy farm, but this farmer had a great idea. You can see on the right-hand corner some debris in the stream. That's the remnants of the old root wads of the tree line there that extended along the riverbank. Now what happened was he decided I can clear those trees out and get me some additional acreage of cultivation in here and increase my productivity. So he cuts down the trees, extends his cornfield out, and what does he do? He loses more than he ever gained. Now the unfortunate thing is there's this bridge just downstream of this, so that's when the DOT became concerned. And they had told him don't cut the trees, but he did anyway. Sometimes we're our own worst enemies. So waterway adequacy. A lot of people wonder, well, what is waterway adequacy? Well, when you go out there and you notice that a bridge is uniform width upstream and it's uniform width, the channel itself is uniform width through the bridge and a uniform width downstream, that's a pretty stable stream, particularly if you don't see any sloughing or vegetation change along the banks. But if you see a channel that bulges out as it approaches the upstream part of the bridge, is wide beneath the bridge and just below the bridge, and then goes back down to the same type of channel geometry as you saw upstream, that's an indicator that there's high velocities through that bridge opening, and so there is some waterway adequacy issue at play there. What it tends to do is those velocities pick up, as we mentioned. It creates what we call a blowhole, which is that ponded area beneath the bridge itself. Oftentimes they'll appear as a teardrop leading off downstream, because what happens is as the velocities slow down on the downstream side, it starts depositing the material from the bed that it blew out from beneath the bridge and creates a small dam. So you might have a couple of foot of water in the flow depth in the upstream channel and a couple of foot of depth of water in the downstream channel, but beneath the bridge you might have 10 feet of water. That is a blowhole, and that is an indicator that the waterway adequacy is marginal. So the role of the bridge inspector. The inspector should adequately record the present conditions at the bridge of the stream. Because if you don't record what's on there, what's at the site today, how will you know how that compares on the next cycle or 5 cycles down the road, just like that Hatchie River Bridge we saw? They documented it, but nobody did anything about it. Well, there's an awful lot of it that's never documented too. So take soundings and document channel cross sections. Identify those critical scour and stream stability conditions that we just talked about and looked at. Promptly communicate the findings up to other disciplines through your maintenance or asset management. Get the design group involved with. Consider monitoring the site more frequently, and if it's bad enough, as we talked about earlier, both Tom and Shay mentioned, close the bridge. So, how many folks in here have we got that have prior military service? Raise your hand. All right, first, thank you for your service. Secondly, I'm sure you're familiar with the role of the forward observer. Forward observers in the military are those folks that are out on point, and they're looking at what's going on, and they're calling in support from artillery, air, sometimes even naval, to actually bring to bear something to provide relief at the site that they're at. And basically, they have all this massive firepower at their command. But in their creed, in the Forward Observer's creed, it has this line: My greatest tool, however, is my radio. And what that means is, without communication, what he sees and what he's doing is worthless. So communication is the key success in the continued engagement with Scour at Bridges. And you, every one of you out there, play a role in that, and you are the forward observer against Scour. So I appreciate it here today.